A suspension of mercy. "28. Thursday dawned sunny and clear, and with the pleasantest of temperatures. It was the kind of day to put an optimistic cast on any work or any problem a person might have, Sidney thought, and he began to feel optimistic about Alicia. Around 8:30 he imagined her waking up, still in Lancing, and feeling cheerful herself about going to her parents today. Well, he wasn't quite sure she'd be cheerful about it, but he felt that she'd go, and that it was all the more likely she would go today because the sun was shining. If it had been a rainy day, she might have retreated, or postponed it, or simply balked. Sidney sat in a patch of sunlight in the living room, writing in one of his notebooks. He had the germ of an idea for a new book and wanted to get something down on paper before, perhaps, the idea evaporated in the atmosphere of Scotland Yard. He did not get very far in the 5 minutes he wrote, but still the germ was on paper, like the beginning of a dream or a poem, and it would grow eventually. The telephone startled him with its loudness. He felt sure it was the police, telling him Alicia was home, or perhaps her mother. "Hello?" Sidney said. "Mr. Bartleby? Inspector Hill here." "Yes?" eagerly. "Can you come up to London this afternoon around 6, Mr. Bartleby? I'd like to see you earlier, but I'm busy until then." "Well, I'm busy also and expecting a couple of important telephone calls today. Would tomorrow—" "I'm sorry," Inspector Hill interrupted in a tone that brooked no refusal. That, at 10 a.m., ruined Sidney's day. The telephone did not ring again before he set out, early and restless, for Ipswich a little after 3. He was in the foulest of moods, depressed, discouraged, and angry. Alicia had better surrender today, or else, Sidney thought. And he had a vision of himself storming into the Lancing cottage, or whatever they had there, dragging Alicia out by the hair and throwing a punch en route at Tilbury with his free hand. He might go down to Lancing after the police interview today. Or if they got unpleasant enough at Scotland Yard, he'd give them the address of Mr. and Mrs. Lehman's. Lancing. Simple as that. Let the police do the rest. In the Ipswich station, Sidney wandered over to the newsstand after buying his ticket. He looked at the Evening Standard headline, "Mystery Woman Found Dead," and at the picture of a cliff, with an arrow pointing to a light-coloured blob at the bottom. The cliff was near Lancing, Sidney read below. He bought the paper. The story was on the front page also. It had happened late last night, police believed, but the body had not been noticed until mid-morning. Then, with a terrible pang in his chest, Sidney read the lines that confirmed his guess. Inhabitants of Lancing identified the dead woman as Mrs. Eric Lehman's, who had recently taken a furnished villa with her husband in the town. Mr. Lehman's was not at the villa. Inspection of the villa disclosed only Mrs. Lehman's clothing, none of her husband, and no papers that might have established her identity, which is now in question. Mrs. Lehman's hair was blonde, but tinted red, and this fact, plus the initials A.B. on a keyring in her skirt pocket, has led police to believe she may be Alicia Bartleby, 26, missing from her Suffolk home since July 2nd last. No handbag was found near her body or in the villa. Police are continuing inquiries as this goes to press. The story must have been broadcast on the radio since noon, and they must know by now that it was Alicia, even if her face had been badly damaged, Sidney thought, and winced. Had she jumped? Or had Tilbury pushed her? Mr. Lehman's was not at the villa. He had evidently cleared himself out. Or had Alicia had a couple of drinks on a lonely night, in a blue funk about whether to go home to her parents or to stick it out a little longer, and thrown herself over the cliff? Sidney couldn't imagine Alicia getting herself into such a state, but he could imagine Tilbury wanting her to give it up before she was found out, rather before he was found out and sacked from his posh job, and Sidney could imagine Alicia resisting that. They might have been having some fine battles. If Tilbury had pushed her and was trying to get away with it, it was absolutely hopeless. Sidney gloated grimly over the welter of things that would trip him. Fingerprints all over the house, the description of him by Lancing people, his steady absence from London lately on weekends, worst of all, his attempt to clear the house of identifiable items. Since no pocketbook was found, it sounded as if Tilbury had been around last night, and he must have been in an absolute panic to be so stupid as to run. Sidney wondered if he had gone back to London last night and reported for work today as usual. Tilbury might have got through the day a little nervously, but still a free, unquestioned man. Sidney looked at his watch. 4:10. In an hour or so, Tilbury might be on his way from his office to his flat in Sloane Street, if the police didn't get onto his trail by then, and why, particularly, should they so soon? It was even conceivable that they wouldn't get onto his trail at all if Vasily and Carpi and Inez didn't choose to talk. Sidney cursed Tilbury as he boarded his train. Whatever had happened in Lancing, Tilbury had mucked it up. He was suddenly glad to be going to London. He might be just a little late getting to Scotland Yard. On the train, he planned and replanned. Ideas built in his mind like clouds piling up in the sky, and just as quickly blew themselves away. It was lovely planning, and his thoughts shot like lightning through the nebulous visions. His final plan was not quite safe. What plan was? But a little daring would carry the day, he thought. He felt he had a 9 out of 10 chance to succeed, which was to say, to accomplish what he wanted to do without interruption, if he acted immediately. If he were interrupted before he began, then he was safe also. To be interrupted during it was not so safe, and would come under the heading of bad luck. He was in London by 5:20, and took a Kensington bus outside Liverpool station. In Knightsbridge he stopped at a chemist's shop and bought, casually from a counter display, a large bottle of sedatives called Dormor. They were probably not strong at all, but it was the best he could do without a prescription, and he was hoping Tilbury might have something stronger at home. The chemist's shop was busy, and he thought he wouldn't be remembered. Sidney hoped he wouldn't have to cut Tilbury's wrists in the bargain if Tilbury didn't have anything stronger at home. Sidney wasn't sure he could. By now it was nearly 6. Sidney walked into Sloane Street and began to look for the number. It was a medium-sized building of 4 stories with 2 small formal stone pillars flanking the front door. 5 names on the bell register, and one of them was E.S. Tilbury. Sidney walked out on the pavement and looked in both directions to see if Dapper Dan were possibly in view, but he wasn't. Sidney pressed the bell. No answer, and Sidney waited a good long while. He rang again. 2 firm blasts. At last the release button came, and Sidney went into a polished, ornate foyer with carpeted stairs beyond. It was possible the police were with Tilbury now, Sidney thought, in which case he'd just have dropped by to speak to Tilbury because of rumours he had heard. The pills were out of sight in Sidney's jacket pocket. Tilbury leaned over the stairwell. "Well, who is it?" "Me, Sidney," Sidney said pleasantly. Tilbury was on the 3rd floor. "Good evening, Edward." A woman came out of a doorway on the 2nd floor with a dog on a leash, glanced at Sidney and went on past. Bad luck, Sidney thought. Tilbury straightened and stepped back. His door was open behind him. He looked frightened and startled, and Sidney saw that he was drunk, or else in a very bad state of nerves. Tilbury's jacket was unbuttoned, also his collar, and he had slid his tie down. "Got time for a few minutes' talk?" Sidney said. "Yes, I suppose so. My goodness, yes. In fact, I wanted to speak to you." Tilbury's not very tall figure swayed a little as he walked through his apartment door. Sidney followed him into an impeccably neat, formal living room with oriental carpet, books, and table lamps that looked like the Victoria and Albert Museum. Firewood was stacked by the black and grey marble fireplace so primly it didn't look burnable. A half-finished highball stood on the coffee table beside an ashtray in which a dozen cigarette butts lay. "Of course you know about Alicia," Tilbury said, glancing at Sidney with desperate, pinkish eyes. "Of course," Sidney said. "Would you care to sit down?" Tilbury asked, gesturing toward the green satin sofa. "No." Tilbury looked at him uneasily, started toward his highball glass, stopped and opened his hands. Excuse me." He slid his tie up and adjusted his collar on his rather plump neck. "I came home from the office today about 3. Couldn't stand it any longer. I'm afraid I've had a few drinks." "Oh, think nothing of it," Sidney said. He was standing about 5 feet from Tilbury. Tilbury picked up his glass. "Oh, forgive me. Would you like a drink?" "No," Sidney said with a slight smile. "Go right ahead." Tilbury looked at the floor. "I owe you an apology. I mean, an explanation, of course. It's very nearly done me in. Last night. You see, last night—" He glanced up at Sidney. "I went chasing out into the night after Alicia. She was in a dreadful state, and I tried to get her to go home to her parents' house. I mean, I tried to get her to before. Many times. She'd had too much to drink last night before I got there. She was unusually upset. Something had happened, she said, but she wouldn't tell me what. Then she dashed out. I lost her for a while in the darkness. She was on that road that goes along the shore. I caught up with her once and actually had her by the hand, but she broke away again. She ran and threw herself off the cliff before I could do anything about it." Edward's free hand opened limply as he finished and looked at Sidney. Sidney did not know whether to believe him or not. If Tilbury had had her by the hand, why had he let her go? Because he wanted to let her go? Or was the story a cover-up for Tilbury's having pushed her? "I don't know what they'll think of me at the office," Tilbury mumbled, loosened his tie once more, and drank from his glass. The office was, of course, uppermost in Tilbury's mind. "So you ran away last night," Sidney said. "Well, I can understand, really. You tried to remove all the signs of yourself from the house. I was in a state of shock last night. It might not have been the right thing to do, but I really didn't know what I was doing." Tilbury's eyes seemed to plead for Sidney's approval, or his forgiveness. "Well, the police haven't questioned you yet, have they?" "No, and I hope they don't. I'm horribly sorry about all this. I loved Alicia, you know. I never wished any harm to come to her. On the contrary, I tried to convince her we were getting you into trouble. Rather, she was, because she wouldn't go back to her family. But Alicia's death was none of my fault. I'd have saved her if I could have done. Whereas if I'm dragged into it now, my career is ruined. Quite unnecessarily, you see." Again the pink eyes looked at Sidney. "Oh, I don't think you're going to be dragged into it." Tilbury looked at him in a puzzled, dubious way. Fatigue had made little puffy bags under his eyes, forerunners of what he would have in middle age, if he had been going to reach middle age. Tilbury was pale, his forehead glossy with a fine sweat. He went to replenish his glass from a bar cart in a corner of the room. "Does anyone else know about you and Alicia?" Sidney asked. "I don't know," Tilbury said, with a glance at Sidney over his shoulder. "Some people might suspect. I'm not sure they'd say anything." "You need a sedative, Edward. Put a sleeping pill or two in that drink." "What?" Tilbury turned with his drink. "Sleeping pills. Have you some?" Edward smiled foolishly. "Yes, but I don't need them now. I take one before I go to bed. Didn't do me much good last night." "Try one now. I insist," Sidney said, walking toward Tilbury. Tilbury didn't know what to make of it. He stepped to one side as Sidney advanced. "Where are they? In the bathroom?" "Get them," Sidney said. "Yes." Tilbury walked obediently toward a door that led off from the living room. "I don't really need them now." "Yes, you do," said Sidney, following him. In the bathroom, Tilbury opened the medicine cabinet door, hesitated, and said, "Looks as if I took the last one last night." He closed the cabinet. Sidney opened it and saw 3 or 4 plastic containers of pills among many little bottles. One with yellow pills in it looked promising because it was in front. "Aren't these sleeping pills?" he asked, lifting the container out. "No," said Edward, in a way that told Sidney they were. Sidney gave him a look. "Well, yes, they are," Edward said, with a fuzzy, frightened smile. Sidney shook one out on his palm, extended it, and said, "You need it." "Oh, no," Tilbury shook his head. Sidney grabbed him by the front of his jacket. "Take it," or I'll smash you to a pulp." Trembling, Edward took it from Sidney's palm and put it into his mouth. He drank it with his highball. "Take another. 2 are better than 1. Tilbury demurred at the second on Sidney's palm, but Sidney shoved his palm closer, his fingertips touching Tilbury's chest, and Tilbury took it and swallowed it. "There," Sidney smiled. "You'll feel better now. Much better for you than Scotch." He walked out of the bathroom with the container of pills. Tilbury came back into the living room. "Sit down," Sidney said. Tilbury was looking at the telephone. Sidney stood between him and the telephone. Then Tilbury turned and ran for the door. Sidney caught him before he touched it and jerked him back with a strength that surprised himself and made Tilbury's neck snap. "You see how nervous you are? Take a couple of these right now." Sidney put his back to the door and poured 2 more pills onto his palm. Tilbury scowled at him. "Come on. No nonsense. Take them," Sidney said. Then Tilbury shrugged and said with an eerily successful attempt at unconcern, "You'll only make me sick, and I'll throw them up." He took them from Sidney's palm. "Go sit down on the sofa," Sidney said. Tilbury took a minute to cross the room in a slow, weaving way, as if he were debating every step. He picked up his glass from the coffee table, glanced at Sidney, who had followed him, and swallowed the pills. Then he sat down on the sofa with a resigned, amused air. Sidney held the container to see how many more pills were left. About 30, he thought. And Tilbury got up and made a wobbling dash for the telephone. Sidney grabbed Tilbury's wrist and twisted it, then put the telephone back in its cradle. 999 will get you nowhere, Sidney said, and shoved Edward back toward the sofa. He had a desire to beat Tilbury to a pulp now, but he realized that wasn't the way. He also realized his fingerprints were on the telephone, but he was going to use the telephone in a few minutes. "Sit down," Sidney said. Tilbury sat down uneasily on the sofa. Sidney went to the bar cart and returned with a cut-glass bowl of canapé biscuits. "A little titbit," Sidney said. He was afraid Tilbury might be sick. Tilbury took a handful as if they might help him. Then Sidney sat down and waited a minute, while Edward looked increasingly worried. "I don't know what you're trying to do," Tilbury murmured, with an attempt at a cheerful smile. "Calm down. You know you need these." "God knows Alicia was difficult," Sidney said in a soothing voice, pouring more pills out. "Now take these slowly, one by one." He gave Tilbury one and went to the bar cart and got the soda dispenser. He put some soda into Tilbury's glass and handed it to him. Tilbury took his pills. "I'm quite sure I'll be sick." The telephone rang. Sidney ignored it, and Tilbury might not have heard it. And finally it stopped ringing. Tilbury was making an effort to sit upright and keep his eyes open. Sidney shook out more pills, offered them on his palm, and as Tilbury looked reluctant, Sidney grabbed his throat, not tightly, but in a crucial place. Tilbury opened his mouth wide for air as Sidney released them. "Don't scream. If anybody comes in, I'll tell them you're taking the pills, because you pushed Alicia over the cliff. You understand?" "Of course you do." "I'm not taking any more," Edward said, and struck Sidney's hand, knocking the pills off Sidney's palm. Tilbury struggled up. Sidney caught him again by the throat and administered a light blow to Tilbury's nose, not hard enough to make it bleed. "Didn't you push Alicia? Didn't you?" "No," Tilbury said in a voice so shaking with fear it was not possible to tell whether he was lying or not. "You can't get any help, Tilbury, and you'll damned well take these pills," Sidney said, still gripping him with his left hand by the throat, hard enough to hold him, but trying not to cause any bruises. "Come on, knock yourself out. It's the easiest way. It's an honorable way, Tilbury. A suicide pact between lovers. Or would you rather I said you told me you pushed her? I came in at 6:15 and found you well on the way, taking an overdose, and you told me you were taking the pills because you pushed Alicia." And 2 things encouraged Sidney now. He believed Tilbury had pushed her, and he didn't think he would have to cut Tilbury's wrists, because he thought the pills were rather powerful. He pushed Tilbury back onto the sofa. Tilbury bounced and sat still, his hands hanging. He looked up with eyes suddenly full of fear again. "I'm not taking any more." Then, twisting, he flung himself off the sofa onto the floor. Sidney picked him up as if he weighed no more than a life-sized doll, fixed him upright against the sofa arm, and got some more pills from the bottle. He crammed the pills into Tilbury's mouth and held the glass of weak Scotch and soda for him, so quickly Tilbury might not have known what was happening. At any rate, the pills were in his mouth and Tilbury was drinking from the glass. Sidney sat beside him, holding him firmly by the shoulder and one arm, against the arm of the sofa. Tilbury did not struggle now. His eyes were beginning to look glassy. Sidney let 4 minutes pass by his watch as he held Tilbury back against the sofa. Sidney shook out some more pills, and Tilbury took them as if he were too sleepy to know what he was doing. He hiccuped once, but the pills stayed down. "That's a good fellow," Sidney said softly. In the next 6 or 7 minutes, Tilbury took all but one of the pills that were left. He took them very slowly into his mouth from Sidney's fingers, like a sleepy child or a bird, and at last slumped sideways on the sofa, his lids open only a slit, his mouth ajar, as if he tried to say something and hadn't the energy. When Tilbury seemed very quiet and his eyes were closed, Sidney looked around on the floor for the 3 pills that had fallen. The third one was under the sofa. Sidney retrieved it and dropped the 3 pills into what remained of Tilbury's Scotch and soda. Tilbury was so far gone Sidney could get only an inch or so of the liquid down him before it started spilling on Tilbury's chin. Sidney then lifted his feet onto the sofa, pulled Tilbury's neatly folded handkerchief from his breast pocket, and wiped his fingerprints from Tilbury's glass, and holding the glass by its rim with the handkerchief, wrapped Edward's limp hand around the glass, and pressed his thumb and fingers on it in a few other spots. Sidney performed the same operation with the soda dispenser. He made a trip to the bathroom to erase prints on the medicine cabinet door, and finally he went to the telephone and called Scotland Yard. He asked to speak to Inspector Hill. "Inspector Hill, I'm sorry, but I got delayed," Sidney said in a harassed voice. "There were telephone calls and people at my house today. I'm sure he couldn't understand, but I've just got to London and I'll see you very shortly." Inspector Hill did not sound at all annoyed. Sidney wiped the telephone, then carried it toward Tilbury, but it didn't reach. He had to lift Edward off the sofa to the floor and press Edward's hand around the telephone there. Then Sidney replaced the telephone with the aid of Edward's handkerchief, removed it from the cradle, and left it lying on the desk. At last he left the handkerchief wadded on the coffee table beside the drink. He'd have to let himself out by touching the doorknobs, but doorknobs were notoriously fuzzy when it came to fingerprints, Sidney knew, and it would look worse to wipe them. He left the apartment. He would drop the Dormoor bottle into a rubbish bin or down a drain in the street, and not in this neighbourhood. 29. In the taxi to Scotland Yard, which Sidney providently caught at Hyde Park Corner instead of Sloane Street or Knightsbridge, it dawned on him that he hadn't remembered to think what it felt like to commit a murder while he was committing it. He had not thought at all about himself. Of course, the murder was not committed yet. It was still being committed. Tilbury was still alive and might live if he were found in the next hour or so and had his stomach pumped. A suspension of mercy, Sidney thought. An absence of something. And yet he had not even been aware of that at the time. No, his action had been merely a brutal, unthinking retaliation for Tilbury's deceit and heinousness in fleeing from Alicia after she was dead or dying. The taxi stopped, and Sidney paid him off. He was passed by a sentinel constable who escorted him to another policeman inside the building, who accompanied him to Inspector Hill's office on the second floor. Inspector Hill was with 2 men in plain clothes, both of whom remained in the office, though Inspector Hill gave his attention to Sidney as soon as he entered. "Ah, Mr. Bartleby, good evening. Sit down, if you please." His telephone rang. "Hill speaking." "Oh, excellent. Well, find him and bring him here." He hung up, passed a hand over his hair and said to Sidney, "We're making progress, finally. I'm sorry indeed about your wife, Mr. Bartleby. The identification was established this afternoon beyond a shadow of a doubt." "I know. I knew," Sidney said. "You knew?" "I knew when I saw the photograph in the paper. The photograph of the cliff." "And for the record, Mr. Bartleby, where were you Wednesday night?" Inspector Hill asked briskly. "I was home that evening and that night." "Can you prove that, if you have to?" Sidney thought a moment. "No." "Well, you may not have to. We are just now on the trail of the man your wife was with, the Eric Lehmans. We have an excellent description of him. Does the name Edward Tilbury mean anything to you?" "Yes," Sidney said. "What?" Sidney glanced at the two interested listeners on his left, one a middle-aged man, the other younger. "I knew since last Friday that my wife was with him, but I wanted to give her a chance to come back herself, on her own. That's why I didn't mention it to the police." "And how did you find out?" "I saw them in Brighton. I didn't know the man's name, but I found it out later." "How, may I ask?" asked Inspector Hill. Sidney knew the police must have gotten Tilbury's name from Inez and Carpy. "I asked a couple of London friends, Inez Haggard and Carpy Dunn." "Mm-hmm. We've just spoken to them. Have they known all along?" the inspector asked with a frown. "No, only as long as I have. You see, I described to them the man I saw in Brighton. And if anyone's to blame for their not telling the police, it's me, because I asked them not to. I didn't tell them I'd seen my wife, or Tilbury either, but I remembered Tilbury paying attention to my wife at a party they gave. I didn't know his name, but I remembered what he looked like." "I see. Well, they're bringing Tilbury here tonight." Sidney was wondering if he should tell the inspector he had written the letter and telegram to Alicia. Alicia might have destroyed them. Tilbury hadn't mentioned the letter or the telegram. The telegram might come out, since the post office kept a record of them for a while. Or if by some wild fluke the police decided to think Tilbury had not been on the scene the night of Alicia's death, the telegram could be seen as a ruse. He had sent the telegram Wednesday morning, jumped on a train and gone to Brighton and Lancing Wednesday night, pushed Alicia over the cliff in a fit of jealousy, cleared Tilbury's things out of the villa to make it look as if Tilbury had killed her, and fled and returned home. Sidney blinked. It really couldn't happen. He wouldn't be able to make it happen, even in a piece of fiction. "You spoke with my wife's parents, I suppose?" Sidney asked, breaking into several seconds of silence in the room. "Yes, around noon today. We corroborated the identity, in fact, by asking her mother if she had a birthmark on the inside of her forearm." Sidney knew the birthmark. A strawberry mark, like a tiny map of France, Alicia had always said. He thought again that her face must have been damaged beyond recognition. "Where is she now?" "Her body is being taken to Kent after the post-mortem," Hill replied, then answered his telephone on the first ring. "Oh? Well, break in then, of course. And call me back." He hung up. "Telephone's off the hook in Tilbury's flat. The light's on and he doesn't answer the door. Interesting." Sidney said nothing. "Where did you see your wife, in Brighton?" Inspector Hill asked. "I'd been waiting in the railway station to see if I could see Tilbury," Sidney said, "or rather, someone who looked like him." He told about following Tilbury in a taxi to where he met Alicia, who then had red hair, and how he had visited towns to the west of Brighton and traced her to Angmering by means of the post office. "I thought it would be a matter of time until she came back herself, or communicated. I didn't want to embarrass her by exposing all this." "We traced them to Angmering too," said one of the officers on Sidney's left. "But just today," said Inspector Hill with a tight smile, and answered his telephone again. "Sorry, I can't talk about that now, Michael. I'm expecting a call, and I want the line free." He had hardly hung up when the telephone buzzed again. "Oh? Yes, I agree. Right. See you." He pressed the cradle, then dialed a single number. "Inspector Hill speaking. I'd like a car right away." He hung up and said, "Tilbury's taken an overdose in his flat. They're getting a doctor. I think we should go over." They all moved, took hats and mackintoshes, and went downstairs to a black car that was already waiting. There were a couple of people in Tilbury's foyer, and a few more on the landing outside his flat door, which was closed. Sidney recognized the woman who had seen him, but she did not seem to pay any particular attention to him. Hill knocked and was admitted to the flat. Sidney followed with the other two men. Tilbury was still on the sofa, and a long rubber tube hung from his mouth and led to a grey enamel cooking pot on the floor. His eyes were closed, his face pale and flaccid. "Not getting much," said the doctor to Hill. "Is it a fatal dose, you think?" asked Inspector Hill. "Depends on how many of these he took," said the doctor, picking up the plastic pill container in which one pill remained. "It's whole-grain seconal." He put the container back on the coffee table. Inspector Hill took it and read the label, which gave a doctor's name, the chemist's shop, and said, "1 or 2 as needed." Hill opened the bottle and sniffed. Then he set it on the coffee table. "Can't get any more out," said the doctor, and removed the tube from Tilbury's throat. "Next step is the hospital." He went to the telephone. Hill looked at his watch and made a wry face. "It'll be hours before Tilbury's fit to talk. Mr. Bartleby, can you spend the night in London? We'll want to talk to you if and when Mr. Tilbury comes too, unless you prefer to go home and come back tomorrow." "No, I'll stay," Sidney said. "Would you give us a ring tomorrow between 9 and 10? "Yes." Sidney said good night to the Scotland Yard men and left. The woman who had seen him was not on the landing, but the 2 men were still there. "How is he?" one of the men asked. "Is he alive?" They'd heard about the overdose, no doubt. "Yes, he's alive," Sidney said, and the message was passed down to the men standing in the foyer. Sidney rang Inez and Carpy from the first call box he came to. He emphatically didn't want to be alone, and they were just the people he wanted to see. "Sidney, darling," Inez sang out, "are you in London?" Inez said they would love to see him and that they were alone, though their telephone had been ringing all evening. They had not been quite alone, Sidney saw as his taxi turned into their Mews street. Alex Polk Faraday was walking away from their house, his head down, though Sidney knew he was aware of the taxi, and of him, because taxis didn't go often into a dead-end street. Alex was avoiding him. "Sidney, come in, darling," Inez said at the door. He was welcomed by restrained embraces from both the girls and words of sympathy about Alicia. They gave him a scotch, which Inez said Carpy had just run out to buy especially for him, and then they questioned him. Had he seen Tilbury? What were the police doing to him? "I just saw him," Sidney said. "He's taken an overdose, and they're getting him to the hospital." "What?" from Carpy. "I'll bet he pushed her, that son of a bitch," Inez said. "Don't you think he pushed her?" "I don't know," Sidney said. "Did he take a fatal dose?" asked Carpy. "I don't know that either. Just that he cleared all his gear out of that villa down there," Inez said. "Even got rid of Alicia's pocketbook, didn't he? Nobody found it. He's guilty, and no wonder he tried to kill himself." Sidney found himself wordless and slightly shaky, even with the scotch. Carpy replenished his glass generously from the bottle. "Can I stay the night?" he asked. "On your couch? I've got to talk to the police again first thing in the morning." "But of course, Sid. Say, have you Ed?" Carpy got up. "We haven't, because we had a visitor till now." "Your old pal Alex," Inez said. "I knew he'd shoo when he heard you were coming. We didn't have to ask him to." Sidney nodded and smiled faintly, no longer interested in what Alex had to say about him. Their series, he supposed, would run its length of 6 installments and stop. Then Sidney realized he could carry it on himself, or at least try to. "He had to change his tune a little," Inez said. "Now he says you're not a wife-killer, just a nut." "As if he isn't," Carpy put in from the kitchen, which was partitioned from the living room. "Gosh, Sid, we shouldn't be joking," Inez said. "It looks like poor Alicia was the one who was out of her mind, staying away for so long." "We didn't tell Alex you knew about Tilbury for a whole week," Carpy yelled over the sound of running water. "That'd have made him even more furious." Her voice was cheery. "I just told the police I did," Sidney said. "Well, so did we today," Inez said. "I hope you didn't mind, Sid. With Alicia—" "I don't mind," Sidney said. "Let's talk about something else. I sold the planners to Potter and Desh this week." He announced it rather lugubriously. There were proper congratulations, and a refill of drinks. The dinner was good, though Sidney could not eat much. The girls put him to bed very soon afterward on the couch, and Sidney fell asleep, listening to their chatter that came faintly from the upstairs regions. He awakened to the morning feeding of the 2 kids. It was 7:45. Sidney realized with a jolt that Tilbury could be alive and talking at this minute. The police, of course, didn't know where to reach him. Sidney had only coffee and orange juice for breakfast. "What do the police want you for now?" Carpy asked. They want me to talk with Tilbury, probably." Inez nearly dropped a plate as she turned to face Sidney. "Gosh, he might be dead, mightn't he? Do you know what hospital they took him to?" "No." And he wouldn't call up to ask if he did know, Sidney thought. Had Tilbury blabbed everything? What kind of sentence would they give a man who'd tried to make someone take an overdose? The same as for murder, of course. Or would Tilbury live and be remarkably, unbelievably noble, and not say anything to the police about his visit from Sidney Bartleby? Would Tilbury possibly try to redeem himself that way? If he were writing it in a story, Sidney thought, could he dare to make Tilbury that noble? Not without a little indication of nobility beforehand. And Sidney had yet to see any in Tilbury. Sidney spent an anxious and sickening hour until 9 o'clock, relieved by a couple of nips of scotch which Carpy pressed on him. Inez had taken the kids out for an airing. Sidney could not bring himself to turn on the radio for the news, and it didn't seem to occur to either of the girls to do it. Sidney rang Scotland Yard. Inspector Hill had not come in yet, but a man he was passed on to said in answer to Sidney's question that Edward Tilbury had died at 4 a.m. "His heart gave out," the voice said. "It always depends on the heart, whether they pull through." The man possibly thought he was speaking to a relative. "Inspector Hill ought to be in any minute." "What's the news?" Carpy asked from the kitchen. "Tilbury died last night," Sidney said. Carpy turned with a dishcloth in her hands. "Goodness! Oh, Christ! A real fatal dose. That sounds like he did push her, doesn't it?" "I don't know," Sidney said. "I don't suppose it matters much. I imagine Tilbury was worried about his job, wasn't he?" "Oh, sure, I know that. I talked with Vasily around 6. My God, I wonder if Vasily knows he's dead." Sidney barely heard her. He was thinking that he ought to call the Sneesums. "May I make a call to Kent, Carpy? I'll get the charges." "Oh, of course, Sid. Alicia's parents, you mean?" Sidney nodded and started putting the call through. He had to get the number from information, as he could not recall it exactly. Carpy went upstairs so he could be alone. A servant answered, and Sidney asked to speak to Mrs. Sneesum. "Just a minute, please. I'll see if she's free." Sidney waited more than a minute. Then Mrs. Sneesum said, "Hello?" "Hello, Mrs. Sneesum. This is Sidney. I wanted to say how sorry I am about Alicia. I'm—" "Oh, Sidney!" Mrs. Sneesum's voice seemed to give way, but she regained it quickly and said, "We're all sorry. I had no idea what was going on. None of us did. Not even you, did you?" "No," Sidney said. "I'm sorry it had to end like this." He was really sorry, and Mrs. Sneesum, for all her stiffness, and her stiff side was the only side Sidney had ever seen, seemed more human and real now than anything he had encountered in the last many days. "Edward Tilbury is dead. I just heard a few minutes ago. He took an overdose of sleeping pills." "Oh, heavens! Oh, good Lord! It's like some horrible tragedy, on a stage. I keep thinking all this has nothing to do with Alicia. It can't be real. Do you know what I mean?" "Yes. Yes. As if his murder of Tilbury wasn't real either. Because Tilbury might have done it himself, if he had lost his job. And there wasn't much doubt that he would have lost it." "Sidney, may I say I think you've been extremely patient. Patient also with our wayward daughter. She drove herself to an extreme, to the brink of death, until she just couldn't take any more. I know it's difficult to talk, but will you come to see us at some point? Drop us a note, Sidney." "That I will. I certainly will," Sidney said, grateful that Mrs. Sneesum was winding up the impossible conversation. "Give my love to your husband." "Oh, my goodness, the funeral. The funeral service will be tomorrow at 11, Sidney, at the little church here." "Thank you, Mrs. Sneesum. I'll be there." "Come to our house tomorrow," she said in a tremulous voice. It was over. Sidney wiped his forehead and fished 2 half-crowns out of his pocket to leave for the call. Carpy started down the stairs. "I'm off to Scotland Yard now," Sidney said. "Thanks so much, Carpy. And for the razor, too." Sidney had shaved with soap and Inez's or Carpy's safety razor. "Will you come by later and see Inez? Ring us anyway." "I'll ring you," Sidney promised. He wasn't sure what Inspector Hill had in store for him, and if he were quite free, he wanted to get back home immediately and think what to do about the house, his life, everything. Sydney came halfway up the stairs to meet Carpy and pressed a kiss on her cheek. "Thanks for being the best friends in the world."
"Oh, Sid, we adore you. You're going to be on our list of celebrities, you know. The Planners has got to be a bestseller."
Inspector Hill met Sydney in the hall outside his office, smiling pleasantly.
"Sorry to have delayed you this morning. I went to fetch a lady, and she was a bit late. A woman who thinks she saw you going into Tilbury's house last evening, around 6.
The inspector looked at Sydney expectantly. Sydney's reaction was the blandest possible, he felt. An "oh?" which admitted and denied nothing, and certainly showed no alarm. The plump woman of about 45, whom Sydney remembered with her dog, was seated in Inspector Hill's office.
"This is Mr. Bartleby," said Inspector Hill. "Mrs. Harmon."
"How do you do?" Sydney said.
"How do you do?" she replied. "Yes, this is the man I saw." "Mr. Tilbury admitted you," said Inspector Hill, still pleasantly. "Mr. Tilbury was in at 6. Is that right?"
"Yes, that's correct," Sydney said.
"That's why you were a little late yesterday?"
"Yes."
"I think that's all, Mrs. Harmon," said the inspector. "I thank you very much for coming in. If you'd like, one of our drivers will take you back to your house."
Mrs. Harmon stood up.
"No, thank you, Inspector. I've an errand not far away. I'd just as soon take a bus."
She gave Sydney another look, a nod of goodbye, then left the office, graciously seen into the hall by the inspector.
"Why did you go to see Tilbury?" asked the inspector as he came in and closed the door.
"I was interested in getting the true story from him, if I could. What really happened to Alicia?"
"Sit down, Mr. Bartleby."
Sydney sat down. So did Inspector Hill, behind his desk.
"And what did Mr. Tilbury say?"
And what if Tilbury weren't dead? Sydney thought. What if the man he had spoken to this morning had been told to say he was dead? The police could later call that information a mistake, to see what Sydney's story would be. "He told me that Alicia was upset Wednesday evening. She ran out of the house and Tilbury tried to catch her. He said she headed for some cliffs by the sea or the sea road, and he couldn't stop her from throwing herself over."
"Did you believe him?"
Sydney hesitated a moment. "Yes, I did." Inspector Hill studied him.
"Did you expect Tilbury to confess or admit to you that he'd pushed her? Something like that?"
"No. I just wanted to hear the real story. I assumed Tilbury knew because he'd been there." Inspector Hill's gaze still rested quietly on Sydney.
"How long did you stay at Tilbury's?"
"I suppose about 10 minutes. Maybe 15.
"Did you ring me from his house?"
"Yes," Sydney said, not wanting to admit this, but if he had rung from a call box, the noise of the push button and falling coins would have been heard by the Scotland Yard operator, and just might have been remembered. Anyway, now he'd said it.
"What kind of mood was Mr. Tilbury in? Surprised to see you, I suppose?"
Maybe Mrs. Harmon had said that, Sydney thought. "Yes, frightened at first, I think. He'd also had quite a bit to drink. He said, after he told me the story, that he was afraid of losing his job if all this came out. And of course he knew it would come out." Sydney was aware that he had no feeling, therefore no look, he supposed, of guilt now. Far less than when he had spoken to people in the early days of Alicia's disappearance. Perhaps that was due to practice. Inspector Hill pressed his lips together in what looked like a resigned smile.
"He didn't say anything to you then about taking pills? Taking his life?"
"No."
"Did you make any threatening remarks to him about telling the story to his law firm, something like that?"
"Oh, no. I knew it had come out without my doing anything."
"I see. And why didn't you mention yesterday that you'd been to see Tilbury?"
"Well, I'm sure I would have mentioned it finally. But I thought Tilbury was going to be brought here yesterday. I wanted to compare what he'd say to you with what he said to me." If I'd been allowed to hear it, or if you'd told me.
Do you think it would have been different?
Probably not. No, Tilbury denied pushing her. He wouldn't have admitted it ever, if he did push her. Sidney spoke calmly. He felt calm. Inspector Hill opened a drawer and pulled out Sidney's brown notebook.
I suppose you'd like this back.
Sidney stood up to take it. I would. Thank you, Inspector. As he touched the notebook, Sidney thought that he would write a description of the Tilbury murder in it while his recollection was still very clear, because the notebook was now, after all, the safest place in which to write it.
A curious little book. Well, Mr. Bartleby, I think that's all I have to ask you or say to you this morning.
Inspector Hill stood up and walked around his desk, looking at Sidney all the while with a remote and thoughtful smile. An accuser who cannot prove, Sidney thought, because the inspector certainly suspected he might have forced Tilbury to take the pills. Sidney could feel the inspector's thought like a radar beam, definite as the hand of the law on his shoulder, only the hand wasn't physically there. The hand was extended, in fact, and Sidney took it. The inspector's attitude was a friendly one, and everything was a matter of attitudes. This concludes the reading of A Suspension of Mercy by Patricia Highsmith, read by Simon Vance.